So in this morning session, we went through a little guided meditation that maybe shifted us out of our head and into the body. And one of the questions, would you like to repeat it, or shall I paraphrase it? Okay. So the question or statement was that very often when this person finds themselves dropping into their body, what is felt is sadness and yearning, longing, and other forms of discomfort. And that where they found themselves going today was a place that is beneath that uncomfortableness, and wanted a little bit of elaboration on whether that was an accurate assessment of things. And to me, it's very accurate, that the peace lies beneath any uncomfortableness, which really is an energetic load in the body, and it tends to be stored in the body. And so often we find ourselves disconnected from the body because it's too uncomfortable to remain present with that load that is embedded, lodged in the body. And so one of the strategies that the biological part of us has developed is to hang out somewhere else. And so when we're directed to come back into the body, which is where a connection to self can happen, because the connection to self doesn't happen in the head. So when we're directed back into the body, sometimes it feels very uncomfortable. So much so that it's counterintuitive to stay there, and we might automatically find ourselves leaving. So we need a reason as to why we should stay there, even if it feels uncomfortable. And that reason, it's a concept. That concept will sometimes act as enough to allow it to make sense to stay there. So the concept is that by feeling these feelings, allowing them to flower, which really means allowing the uncomfortableness to become even more intense, which completely doesn't make sense to us on one level. But the theory says that if that happens, we can come to see what the story is at the bottom of the feelings. Usually we just know it as an uncomfortable feeling that has no real definition. We don't really know it well. We're not sure what it's made up of. It's just uncomfortable and we want to get away from it. And what is at the root of that uncomfortableness is this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. The identity essentially is contained in this energetic load in the body. The identity in the form of this uncomfortableness, because the identity is really an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. And if the story at the bottom of that feeling is not understood, not seen, then it never really dissolves. But at some point when we've become equipped with an intellectual understanding about what human suffering is and where it stems from, the different forms in which it takes, guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes, then once we're sufficiently equipped with that understanding, it means that there is the potential for these feelings to be felt and for them to start being seen for what they are, according or in line with these descriptions. And as they're seen for what they are, the error that is at the bottom of them, the error of doership and attachment to outcome, that was locked away many years ago when the event that locked this attitude in place happened, the error that was in place back then can be seen, not judged. So when I say error, I don't mean that it is an ultimate mistake. It's actually part of how life is meant to be, but it's an error relative to what we truly are. And once it's seen, it's able to be released. It's like, I don't believe this. I can no longer support it. But to the extent that it's not looked at, it will remain there as if it's true. And so if we understand that this is the process that happens by which the deeply ingrained beliefs of personal doership get relieved from the body, released from the body, then we have a rationale that says, now I know why it makes sense for me to remain present with these uncomfortable feelings. And maybe even allow the uncomfortable feeling to flower and encourage it to flower. And there's various ways in which we can encourage it to flower. So this isn't something that you are going to set out and do. You don't wake up on Monday and go, okay, this afternoon I'm going to feel these feelings. They may not present themselves in a way. We're talking about stuff that's deeply, deeply ingrained in the body, in the unconscious, which we really don't have access to. So we can't just decide, I'm going to do this afternoon. The purpose of this discussion is to bring it into awareness, bring the dynamic into awareness. It becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, and then at the right time, automatically, it will start happening. The right time is a particular moment when, a particular day when you wake up and you feel this uncomfortableness, like a dull uncomfortableness. And one of the ways that we tend to suppress these feelings, because they're uncomfortable, is through habits and addictions. We have come to see that if we can give ourselves some pleasure, then receiving pleasure tends to cut off the uncomfortable feeling. It doesn't deal with it, it just hides it or distracts us from it. And sometimes if that feeling is continuously there, we find that we continuously need these support systems, these crutches, to make it bearable. And that's what addiction tends to be, where we have a compulsive movement towards pleasure, which is driven by a deep uncomfortableness. And so the driving towards pleasure, which can take the form of any sorts of addictions, that movement is driven by this uncomfortableness, so we can't resist it in a sense. We feel compelled to move towards the pleasure. And so when we find ourselves compelled, when we see ourselves addicted to something, to understand why this is happening can be helpful. To try and criticize ourselves for having the addiction is much less helpful than to understand it and to be non-judgmental about it. To understand it's mechanical. The more uncomfortable the feeling is, the more drive we're going to have towards a solution to it. And unfortunately, addiction is not an ultimate solution. It's a temporary solution. And it's a solution that tends to further enhance the underlying identification or false idea of who we are, because we indulge in the pleasure and then we tend to feel guilty for having done that. And what we find is that at the root of the uncomfortableness is guilt and blame. So to the extent we start feeling guilty about the fact we've indulged in a pleasure in an addictive fashion, the guilt at the root of the uncomfortableness just gets deeper, which means the uncomfortableness gets stronger, which then means compulsion towards the addiction is even stronger, which means we consume or indulge in that pleasure even more, which then we feel guilty about, and the guilt gets deeper, and the suffering is stronger, and the compulsion towards the addiction is stronger, and so on and so on. So that solution that the body has come up with, when we look at it objectively, we see, actually, this is never solving the problem. And at some point, a realization that this habit is not solving the problem and seeing what is actually happening can start to make the addiction seem less logical. Now, logic, when we're talking about addiction, which is driven by deep, deep uncomfortableness, doesn't often come into it. But it can definitely be one of the ways that when we hit rock bottom, that if there's a realization this is not solving the situation, that can be the required push to break a habit. So how the uncomfortableness starts getting weaker and weaker is if the identity that is at the root of the uncomfortableness starts to dissolve. And the identity is always a set of beliefs about who we are and what we need, beliefs that are inaccurate, beliefs that have been locked away based on an attitude to a circumstance that happened at some point in our life, usually a circumstance that was traumatic, delivered a lot of pain, was delivered through the actions of another or through the actions of myself. And so at the base of this trauma there is usually guilt and blame, hatred and shame. So I've mentioned that this is right at the deep level of our unconscious, this root, and we can't access that. So how do we start? How do we get there? How do we come to see what the story at the root of this energetic load is? And an analogy that could work is to imagine the ocean with a buoy floating on the top of it. And we can see the buoy on the top of the ocean. And in theory, the buoy is connected to an anchor. And the anchor represents the deep, ingrained, false belief of who we are. Ultimately going back to that original error, that I have been kicked out, that I am not good enough. And all the way up to the top of the ocean, there are secondary and tertiary buoys down between the top buoy and the anchor. And we can't see any of the other buoys, and we can't see the anchor, which means they're not available to us at this point. What is available to us is the buoy on the surface of the ocean. We can see that, and the buoy on the surface of the ocean represents the uncomfortableness that arises from time to time that we are aware of, that comes up into our conscious. Essentially, that uncomfortableness is like radiation that radiates off a piece of radioactive material, and we can feel the radiation. And that uncomfortableness is either going to be triggered by something that happens in the flow of life. Someone says they're going to do something and they don't. And that pain in the moment, that pain as part of the flow of life, triggers our attitude of doership and our attitude of attachment to outcomes, and blame arises. Or the uncomfortableness might just be there for no explainable reason. Nothing particular is gone wrong in the day, and yet we feel this uncomfortableness. So whichever way it happens, the uncomfortableness can be a blessing if the process ends up being a process of exploring it and discovering something that was not seen until that exploration happened. So it means putting aside the idea that what my job as a spiritual seeker is to witness everything. Because although witnessing is a very important, crucial part of the process, at some point when it comes time to feeling deeply these energies that have been suppressed, at some point witnessing doesn't support this process. So we can put witnessing aside just for a day or an hour. We can always come back to it and reassume the witnessing, and we will, because what's being suggested here is that a combination of feeling and witnessing at different times are valid. Also, putting aside the notion that we might have that our objective is peace of mind, and that peace of mind is the absence of suffering, because if we hold on to that too strongly, then encouraging suffering to flower tends to be counterproductive to the idea that what I'm looking for is peace of mind, which is the absence of suffering. So we can still hold that objective in mind, that really I'm looking for peace of mind, but one of the ways in which peace of mind, or the way that peace of mind eventuates, is if all of these false beliefs are undone, and in practice, the very deep root of these beliefs is undone when the feeling is experienced and felt and released. So we need to intellectually have a foundation that allows us to really feel these feelings. So assuming that your partner has done something that you don't like and blame is there. The blame really is not about your partner and what has happened. Although on the surface, it feels like it's completely about what they have done. Really, this intense blame for your partner, or subtle blame for your partner, is being fueled by this load of doership that has been locked away year after year after year, or day after day after day for years, based on the way that we have seen life by and large. Seen life as something that me and the other are in control of, and seen myself as a physical entity that requires certain things, that is threatened by life as it often happens. So that attitude to life, which life put in place, that was imposed upon us, has over time locked away a very deep load of guilt and blame. Guilt is associated with shame, and blame, hatred. So we have a load of shame and hatred that is triggered by what someone does in the present moment. And so that means that what someone does can create an explosion, not only an explosion where we physically make it known that we're unhappy, but more importantly, the internal uncomfortableness. And so we can be extremely judgmental, extremely annoyed at what someone has done, thinking it's all about that. You know, it's all about the fact you didn't send me a message when you said you were going to send me a message, whereas actually the load that we're feeling is not really about what's happening in the present moment. But nonetheless, the present moment and that blame in the present moment is this buoy on the surface that we have access to. And so to the extent that we can sit with this feeling, not necessarily in the presence of the person that we're blaming, take it into a private place, a place where we have feel the freedom to express fully, maybe shout, maybe cry, and really embody this feeling of blame. And that means putting words onto it, words that the feeling really tell us. And that means it can be hard at first because we don't want to admit sometimes what the feeling is saying. So the feeling is saying, I hate you, I detest you, I want to kill you for what you have done. And so feeling this means allowing the feeling to fully flower. Don't get in the way of it. Surrender to the feeling being there and allow it to take over. Where's the microphone?
Quick clarification on that. What you're describing sounds like deep psychological work, and it sounds like work one could have done in a therapist's office or in group therapy or in similar therapeutic situations.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's what you mean, or this is something a little bit deeper and more different.
This isn't therapy, except it is, in a way. This is becoming in contact with what's really there. And what's most important is that the intellectual understanding, which over time has gone deeper and deeper, so it might not be just a cursory intellectual understanding. What's really important is that understanding is there, is seeing life on a conscious level very differently to how it saw it in the past. Seeing life as a happening, a creation according to God's will, not my doing, seeing myself as an instrument through which everything happens, pleasure sometimes, pain at others, understanding that I'm forced in a particular moment to act according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, seeing the other as the same, an instrument in the dream of life, part of the unfolding story of life, forced to act according to genes and up-to-date conditioning, understanding that what happens through the other is not in my control, not in their control, etc., etc. And with that understanding, which is usually quite different to what a therapist or psychologist will propose, because not everyone, not many people that turn up in a psychologist's office are actually ready. When I mean ready, the identity that is in place is maybe so dense that these notions will make no sense, will be of no benefit. So in a psychologist's office, a different approach, which is more suited to a particular identity makeup, makes sense. And so really, even though on the one level it's the same, the guidance that is being provided, the understanding that's in place that observes what comes up, can be radically different. Mm-hmm.
So, understood, but it can build on the psychological work, right? So you've done a lot of psychological work, then you get to this understanding and you realize, oh wow, this is the understanding. So then when new stuff comes up and all the new emotions come up, you look at it and you allow them to leave you. How do you know when you're done?
Yeah. So let's make it clear that therapy and psychological work are, like you said, are completely linked to this. That non-dual teachings were historically kept locked away, even within the community of people that were seekers. So monks would be monks and seekers for many years before they were allowed to access these teachings, simply because if someone isn't ready to hear these teachings, they won't have an impact, or they could be taken on by the identity and become part of the identity and deepen the dysfunction, creating despair or depression, maybe creating narcissistic behavior, creating a belief system that can support behavior that is unhealthy and maybe harmful to oneself and the other. Mm-hmm. So the work that happens in psychologist's office is, like all teachings, is perfect for whoever finds themselves there until such time as it is no longer perfect. And then they find themselves moving on. So the work that has happened in psychologist's office can be very, very useful. And then we might look back on it and go, oh, that's what was happening. In maybe a a limited version of what's being suggested here, or maybe not even a limited version, maybe just the beginning, and this is a continuation. So we know when we're done because suffering stops arising. Suffering in life arises when this load still exists in the body. And the load meaning the set of beliefs, and which is energetic really. All beliefs and thoughts are ultimately all energetic. And the suffering that arises either in the form of thought, which is a particular form of energy, or it arises as a feeling in the body, which is effectively thought in a very condensed form. That's why when you feel the blame, you'll be able to find a story at the bottom of it. So when you feel into the blame, it will be, I hate you. That's a story, right? When I say story, it's a story about the situation, a story about oneself and the other. I hate you for what you did to me. It was an attack on me. The pain you delivered was wrong, and as a result, I am less complete.
And so that distinguishes suffering from pain, and that does mean that in life we don't get triggered. We might still get triggered, but we might feel pain, but we won't suffer.
That's right. Usually the word trigger refers to the triggering of these deeply ingrained beliefs, and it triggers suffering, which really means that the flow of life is not the cause of the suffering. The flow of life is what triggers our attitude, which often is a incorrect attitude to how life really is, and that incorrect attitude is an attitude of uncomfortableness with oneself and the other. And to the extent that those beliefs dissolve, what will happen is life will continue to unfold, definitely painful still, and then the pain won't find won't trigger a story, because the beliefs on which the story arises have been seen to be false and dissolve, which takes time. It doesn't seeing them and going, I don't believe. In doership, I can see for myself that doership is a belief that gets put in place when the mechanics of life are not clearly seen. So if we have that understanding, even quite a deep understanding, that can clearly see that this belief in doership doesn't make sense, doesn't automatically dissolve the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership. The beliefs will come out over time in this energetic release form, which is not the only way they get released. Often they do get released just by seeing, but a lot of it has to come out in this form. And it can come out over many sittings, in a sense. So to the extent that we're open to the fact that this is a valid part of the process, and that we can surrender to feeling this uncomfortableness and fully expressing it. Each time that happens, we will probably find that our experience over time shows us that we start to feel lighter in the body. Because this load is a very dense form of energy. And the denser the energy, the more heavy it feels. And the more full the body is of this heavy energy, one, the more easily we're going to be triggered, and two, the more defined as this entity we feel. There's less space inside. And as these energies start to come out, we start to feel more space, which in itself is a relief. And secondly, we find ourselves walking through life with circumstances unfolding more or less as they did before, and yet our reaction to the circumstance, which is not really our doing, we realize, wow, I can't explain it, but now I'm not reacting in the same way as I did before.
Yeah. Okay, and thank you. That's really helpful. And just a couple more clarifications. You'd mentioned sometime in this satsang, there's 3 kinds of pain: emotional pain, financial pain, physical pain. and in life any of them can arise, but you don't need to suffer from them. So is emotional pain the one that's linked to the triggers?
No. All of those are pain in the flow of life, and emotional pain is the one that is the hardest to understand, because it will seem like suffering is emotional pain. Suffering isn't emotional pain. Suffering is psychological. Emotional pain is biological, and suffering is psychological. Now, what that means is, so what's an example of emotional pain? And I can use myself as an example, is if after a satsang I receive messages or someone comes up and says, the satsang was really helpful. Thank you so much. Then that's part of the flow of life. And it's not physical pleasure. It's not as though someone has given me a chocolate and I tasted the chocolate. If I tasted the chocolate, that's physical pleasure. If someone were to come and give me $50, that we could call, and say nothing, just say this is for you, that we could say is financial pleasure. And if someone doesn't give me a chocolate, which is which is physical pleasure, and doesn't give me $50, which is financial pleasure, and they just say, look, I want you to know that this is really important to me. Thank you for what you shared. Then that's what I would say, I like to hear that. It's emotional pleasure. If someone on the other hand comes up and starts saying, what you say is a load of nonsense and you have no social skills, blah, 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 compare the two, and I know one I would like and one is less pleasurable.
It didn't bother you at all.
So that's true, because we can sometimes I might understand, or often I understand, that if someone comes up and says all of these things, it's not really a reflection of reality. And to the extent I see that what they're saying is just a way that they're forced to receive what is said, then I'm not going to give it much weight. But let's change the example a little bit. Let's say I have a friend that I can care about a lot, and they ask for some help, and when I receive the message, I'm very busy, and I don't realize that it's that important. And I say, I'm very sorry, I can't help you today. And then the next time I meet them, they come up and say, take the two examples. One, they say, yes, I can help you, and the other, sorry, I can't help you. In the situation where I help them, they come, the other day when you helped me, it meant so much. I needed help. I thought I was in real trouble, and you turned up. Thank you. And I love my friend to receive information that they feel the friendship is good, and I served a helpful role. That's very nice, emotional pleasure. To the extent I said, I'm sorry, I can't turn up, and they took it in a way that hurt them. Not my intention. But they come up to me and they're crying and they're saying, I actually feel you've completely let me down. And explain it, and wow, it didn't occur to me that it was this important. And I see that I could have, in theory, if I had changed some things around, I could have turned up for them. And I go, wow, not my intention to hurt you. And I'm sorry that it hurt you. Actually, I'm sad that someone I love has been hurt. So we can compare the two. One is pleasurable. Oh, I'm great. That's so nice that I help it. And the other one is, wow, you're telling me that it's really hurt you. I'm sorry. So that's emotional pleasure or pain. Yeah. And remember, pain is always painful because the circumstance is out of line with our biological preferences, part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And pain is always there because the flow of life is out of line with our biological preferences.
Just on that quickly, does that also mean, so emotional pain, if somebody you love is sort of destroying themselves in front of you and you can't do anything about it because it's their life?
Sure.
And you love them a lot, but you can't do anything. No, you mean you've tried, you've talked to them, but they're still hell-bent on destroying themselves. And you just watch this happen and you feel the pain.
Very much so.
And that's pain.
Yes.
But that doesn't have to be suffering.
Now we'll distinguish the difference between emotional pain and suffering. But yes, exactly. So if someone we love dies, that's going to be emotional pain. If someone we love arrives in the place that we are after 5 years of not seeing them, that'll be emotional pleasure. And then let's talk quickly about physical pleasure and pain. Much easier to understand. If I hit my toe on the wall, that's physical pain. If I go out in the sun and it's the perfect temperature, physical pleasure. If I eat good food, it's physical pleasure. The food is sour and bad, physical pain. The water is too hot, physical pain. The water is too cold, physical pain. And so on and so on. The bed is comfortable, physical pleasure. The pillow is, etc. Financial pleasure and pain, right? You have a certain amount of money in your wallet, and then you open your wallet and you find that you've lost some. Someone's taken some. It's not there anymore, so it's financial pain. Someone gives you money for some work you've done or as a present, financial pleasure. You have to, in life, pay for things to the extent that you don't have enough money to pay for something, or it's stretching you. The more, if someone has lots and lots and lots of money, the money is just not an issue for them, they're less likely to have financial pleasure and pain in life. Although the psychology of someone in relation to their money may mean they could have plenty of money and still, if they lose $10, could create financial pain. And then the question is that financial pain or is that psychological pain? And it's a fine line that, as we investigate this for ourselves, it starts to become clear between the difference. And similarly, if you miss your airline, you miss your connecting flight, and you have to buy another ticket, that you've already got a ticket that you've missed and it costs you $1,000 or $4,000 or whatever, financial pain. Undeniable, this is not ideal, that I've had to buy another ticket because I missed my plane by 5 minutes, and the last minute ticket is $4,000 because I have to get to that place. Very unfortunate, but at the end of the day, it's financial pain. So the flow of life is always, only ever, pleasure or pain. Now, what is suffering? Suffering is never a result of the flow of life, never a result of the stubbing of the toe, or the comfortable bed, or the missing of the airline or the family. That's always pleasure or pain. Suffering is our attitude to the pleasure or pain. Our attitude that makes us unhappy in life is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. The attitude of doership is the attitude that sees the other as the doer, myself as the doer. And the attitude of attachment is the attitude that sees my happiness to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. My happiness to be found in circumstance. And so our unhappiness in life is never because of the circumstance, but always because of our attitude to the circumstance. And the attitude that delivers happiness is simply the absence of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome.
And even life is not the doer.
That's right. There is no
God no doer
to blame.
Even life is not the doer.
That's right.
Quickly, one last thing. So, I've always struggled to feel anger, and I have felt anger, and it's come in hot. I've either been livid or nothing. And through all the work that I've done so far, including therapeutic work and this work, the only emotion that I haven't experienced is anger. And I'm just wondering whether that's something that's hidden or not, or it's gone, or it's been dealt with, or I should just keep an eye out, and when it comes, it comes.
Yes, I would suggest just intuitively that the deepest emotion that you'll find is anger. Usually the two suppressed emotions are sadness and anger, and one usually presents itself first and then reveals the other beneath it. And so going back to what we were talking about before, when we're talking about feeling emotions, we can start to see how this fits in. So often if someone feels a lot of sadness, they come in contact with sadness, and that's expressed. At some point it will morph from sadness into anger. And we can be surprised sometimes that, wow, this anger, and usually the suppressed stuff comes up with great intensity, and be surprised like, wow, I didn't know this was there. And vice versa, someone might feel a propensity to getting angry, and when they go deep they find, surely, yes, there's lots of anger. And then that anger, if it's expressed, will start to morph into sadness or grief. And the person, sometimes angry people are quite, strong people, and they haven't felt sadness, and they can be surprised. Wow, I didn't know that this sadness, which is, and grief, not just sadness, grief is, like you said, a better, because grief refers to the suffering aspect around what has happened to us, whereas sadness is, like anger, just a biological reaction, not psychological. So sadness could fit into the category of emotional pain, and anger is emotional pain when it's just anger that arises vertically and sadness that arises vertically. And when that anger and sadness get dragged out horizontally, it's grief and hatred, grief and blame, not biological sadness and anger. And yes, so to someone who gets angry and feels this anger in their body, at some point it might start turning into grief. And it's like, oh, I didn't realize I was so vulnerable.
Watch this space, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah. So going back to this feeling thing, we've got the boy on the surface, which is the blame for something that has just happened in this morning, for example, and we can feel the blame. We sit with it, and one of the reasons that you might not feel anger often is because we've got a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts that tell us how we should behave in life in order to get the best outcomes, in order to get the love of the other and pleasure. And so life has conditioned us in such a way that it said you shouldn't get angry. Angry is the worst thing you can do in order to get love from the other. And so our strategy has become so finely tuned that whenever anger arises, it gets suppressed. And so in this allowing things to flower, there needs to be a willingness to really express anger and feel anger.
How?
By firstly recognizing that maybe there is some belief system that says don't feel anger. It's you to survive in life have to not be angry. And seeing that as a conditioning that prevents us from being present, being a witness, is important. And at some point we might realize, actually, I'm angry. And somehow there's some thought system that's going on that's making me see the situation in such a way that my anger gets suppressed. Yeah. So what I'd like to get to the point in is when we start feeling the blame for the other for what they've done, the blame in something that's happened right now, and we fully express it, what can happen, just like it morphs from anger into sadness at some point. On this top level, it might morph from being angry at your partner that did something this morning and turn into an anger for your brother or sister, let's say.
What if, like in my situation, I've worked through all that, right? I've spent 2 decades working through everything that I had to be angry about, so sort of an felt anger, and not like I imagine anger should be felt, but I have felt it and gone through lots and lots of therapy and also spiritual work and this feeling work that you describe. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe it's gone.
I have no problem acknowledging that
it could be gone. It could be.
Yeah.
But it could still be there.
Yeah. This process is a process that, the more people that say, hey, it's gone. In my experience, so what Brandon described yesterday, he was basically saying, in my experience, suffering has been reducing over an extended period of time, over 7 months and maybe even longer. The seeking can be longer than that. But in particular, after having thought it had gone and then something came up and he was, oh no, there's some more there. So you have periods of it gone. And then at one stage, at some point, it's like, okay, now I've had an extended period again where it hasn't arisen.
Ah.
And to the extent that more and more things in the flow of life happen that are painful, and we find that suffering doesn't arise,
yeah,
the more and more convinced from our own experience we can be that
it's gone.
It's gone. Still, we're open to the fact that who knows, maybe a particular event of a particular type will trigger something that's left, but really who cares?
Yes.
Until that happens, I'm not going to worry about it. At some point I'll say, well, for all intents and purposes, it's gone.
Mm.
And when it comes up, if it comes up, then you look at it.
And I wanted to check that by doing the psychological work and by getting the understanding intellectually and by immersing so much in the path, can it be that because of that, whenever the anger is supposedly coming up, that's, the intellectual understanding's kicking in and saying, well, there's no doer there, they didn't mean it, what's the point of getting angry? And then the anger gets suppressed and put back into the body.
That can very easily happen. But if that happens, first the process of understanding the concept has already... So to understand it at that level is very beneficial, and then it can it can turn into a bypassing or a new belief system. But as long as we're very sensitive to what suffering feels like, as long as our awareness has now landed on what an uncomfortableness with oneself is, which is what suffering is, if it becomes a spiritual bypassing, something inside will say, no, something's not right. The suffering that is because spiritual bypassing, basically a belief system that is suppressing things, is suffering. And at some point it will be felt as suffering, and awareness will land on the belief structure, and it will get undone. So when we say, how do I know when it's done? It's because we find ourselves moving through life without suffering. That's the litmus test. And the it started off at the beginning, what are we really looking for? And the answer is whether we understand it or not, whether we realize it or not, we're looking for happiness, and happiness is important. It's important to note happiness is peace of mind, the absence of suffering. And we know that when we get that, when it's there, it's self-confirming that, oh, this is what I want. Because peace of mind means the absence of expectation. the absence of attachment to outcomes, which is where expectations tie into. So it means I have no expectation of the present moment, and I feel comfortable with the present moment as it is. Still, comfortable means on an attitudinal level. The present moment might be painful, and this acceptance, this comfortableness, doesn't mean that we biologically don't do something to try and fix the pain in the moment.
It feels very big and deep, what you describe.
Mm-hmm.
That if that happened, it would be totally clear.
If the peace is there, when we become aware of the fact that what I'm looking for is peace, at some point there's no doubt whether it's there or not. We generally have a doubt whether it's there or not, either if we're not very clear on what we're looking for, which means there's an expectation, which means there isn't peace, or if there's some other subtle form of suffering that is creating a flatness in a sense. So some forms of suffering, subtle forms of suffering, just create a flatness, and something intuitively says, like, is this it? Is this it? And that's why, so when we talk about suffering, someone goes, oh yeah, no, I don't suffer, but they're not convinced. And usually that's because there is a suffering, but it's a subtle form of suffering that's not registered, like boredom could be a form of suffering. Apathy, yes. And so it's not taking the normal, more intense forms of suffering, but it's this subtle underlay that feels uncomfortable on a subtle level. Okay, we'll go. Oh no, you had first. Let's go here. Is it just these two hands at the moment? Oh.
I was just glad you were touching on boredom.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I have kind of exactly like what she's saying, only opposite is that I was never allowed to express any anger, but I have a partner now that I guess I feel loved enough by that I can express my anger. It's not very helpful. And it is helpful to some degree to have that much love or space, but it's like anyway, one of the reasons that I wanted to ask you about this is right before I came, this just as an example, he's working really hard to get the house ready to be sold. Something had broken off, and he said, you did this when you were vacuuming or something, and it triggered me, and I was like, okay, because of the fact that I have so much shame, I'm very aware of being triggered by shame. Somehow other people blaming me or judging me penetrates still the peace. So how do I not blame the person for blaming me, or put a buffer or just something? Because like I've left retreats because of this. I mean, it's just like other people have too much power to trigger this. Mm-hmm. And then obviously I don't get mad at anyone else because that's not right, but I can with him. But
so you see the question: how do I do this? Right, plays into this idea that we can do it, whereas what you're describing, the feeling of shame arising when you're, I'm not going to use the word blamed by the other. It is blamed, but when you are accused of something by the other. Then that's a description of a dynamic that happens, right, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So how it stops happening is when the genes and up-to-date conditioning change. Now, life put the genes and up-to-date conditioning in place. You didn't do it. And it's the same mechanism that brings about change. Life brings about the change. The fact you're here and this is what life is bombarding you with means that life is bringing about the change. At least it's delivering, to keep the concepts clear, at least it's delivering the new conditioning. But based on the conversations we've had, I can see that the new conditioning has affected your up-to-date conditioning. And you can see that your up-to-date conditioning changing means that your experience in life, the suffering, starts to change. So obviously, because suffering is uncomfortable, we would like it to not be there at all. And that's what inspires the question, how do I change it? And so we might be able to see that, once again, very understandable, but what it is an expectation of how life should look. That says, okay, how do I do this? I want to know how to do it. And so the answer is you can't do it, right? Which sounds terrible, but if we accept it, it's much less terrible than it sounds, because the accepting that I can't do it, which on the surface looks like a defeat, is actually an undoing of the very conditioning from which the shame and the blame arise. So if someone says, how do I change it? And I say, life changes it. Life put that in place, that conditioning that I am the doer. That's the conditioning, that's I am the doer. And so what you remember, it's when that conditioning changes, suffering will stop arising. So if I say, you can't do it, and you say, oh, of course, I can't do it, I'm not the doer, isn't that the changing of the conditioning, that I am the doer on which the suffering arises?
Yeah, that would produce more of a witnessing of it happening, which gives me more of an identity in the space versus the behaviors, which then neutralize the behaviors.
Exactly. And this is the irony of it, is that the notion that you can't do it on the surface sounds like, oh, that's disappointing to hear. And the actual recognition, of course I can't do it, is the very changing, because the doership would say, the doership belief doesn't see that everything is a happening. So the very realization, oh, of course I can't do it, I don't want to do it, because that implies me being the doer. It doesn't make sense for me to ask how, because I see I'm not the doer. So if you were to exclaim that all of a sudden, from your own seeing, right? Not just because it's the right thing to say. If you really see it, what we see is what sounds like terrible news, the admitting that I can't do anything, is actually the changing of the belief in doership.
And when I have said that or felt that, there's a huge grief, like that, a loss that so much time has gone into therapy and ways of trying to prevent or manipulate, like the avalanche or whatever. I can feel the avalanche building in me, and then I'm like, oh gosh, I either take it out on myself, or I guess now this is the first person, but so like with John, he to tell him I'm not the doer. He doesn't follow this, so he sees the doer doing it. It would look like a cop-out to him, but I know that's not what you're saying. You're just saying it creates the space, because I just don't want to be like that. It's not a... Yeah.
So good point in a sense. This understanding is not going to absolve us of responsibility from society or towards society, because society is still going to judge us as good or bad, depending on the outcomes that happen through us. They'll reward us, this is Ramesh used to say, will reward us for those actions that deliver pleasure to society and punish us for those actions that deliver pain to society. So telling the judge, oh, but I'm not the doer, is not going to prevent you from going to prison. The judge will say, well, I'm not the doer either, but you're going to prison, not my doing. And that's correct, right? So telling the other that you're not the doer is pointless, in a sense. unless it's in a teaching context, maybe where they want to understand these things, because then it will affect their peace of mind. So knowing that you're the doer is good for you only on your internal level. So another thing that arose when you were talking is, let's be very certain and clear that when I talk about blame being one of the forms of suffering, I'm not talking about being blamed by the other, right? That's pain in the moment. If the other blames you, that is pain in the moment, emotional pain by and large, let's say. If they blame you and hit you, then that's physical pain. But the blame which is our suffering is the blame if we blame them for blaming us, right? Which I think you understood. But to be clear, that when someone blames us, that is pain in the moment. That's not the blame which is being referred to as a form of suffering. It's when we blame the other. That's a form of suffering. And if the other blames us, which is pain in the moment, and we believe that what they are saying is true, as in, because if someone's blaming us, they're effectively saying you are not an adequate human being in this moment. And if we hear it and we believe that I'm not an adequate human being in the moment, which means I see myself as the doer, which is what the other person is pointing out, and I feel shame, then that's my suffering in the form of guilt. Right? So that, and the other thing that's useful, in, because I think this discussion is a good one, but we're talking about anger a lot, and we have to be clear, all the times that I've said anger, when we talk about anger arising, really what we're talking about is blame arising. And so if we can start to distinguish between anger and blame, it's a very important distinction because they're quite different. Anger in this teaching refers to a biological reaction of anger, just like a biological reaction of sadness. If someone that I love dies, I'm going to have biological sadness, but based on the fact that the belief in doership and attachment to pleasure is not around, as long as that's not around, the sadness won't turn into suffering. Right? And similarly, anger is a biological reaction that arises in the moment, and in pure anger there is no belief in doership or attachment to outcome. But because anger is pain in the moment, for us it's not a nice biological reaction, because it's pain in the moment, and it's usually inspired by a previous pain that the other has delivered. So there's two pains in that moment. It's often accompanied, and when I say often, almost always, simultaneously accompanied by blame, based on our belief in personal doership. And so what we experience when we say I got angry is a mix of biological anger and a much heavier load of blame. And so for us to be able to separate this out, we start off intellectually understanding, it's a load of anger plus blame. And the uncomfortableness is the blame.
So for example, if I see somebody kicking a dog.
Just,
I'll give it back. So if I see somebody kicking a dog and I get really angry with them, or locking a child up in a hot car and not leaving the window open, and anger arises in that moment, the suffering will arise when if I can't in that moment see they're not the doer, and that's just a happening, and so there's nobody to blame. And so that suffering bit wouldn't arise, but the anger would still be there.
yes.
Similarly, if I get disgusted at somebody's behavior, I can just be like, oh my God, that's disgusting behavior, but they're not the doer.
That's right. And so that's correct. But in those cases, because it's such a personal, usually anger and disgust is pain that is very personal in a sense, it's very close to home, the absence of doership it really needs to be absent. The doership aspect needs to be completely gone in order for blame not to arise with those particular pains. So what normally happens is there is anger and blame simultaneously arises. But biological anger is often appropriate, right? If I'm standing near the edge of a cliff and suddenly someone comes running past in my line of, and I see this, biologically I could just step forward and push them, onto a different line of track because they're about to bump into me and there's a cliff behind me. Yeah. So that anger is not blame in its pure, it's biological and it makes sense in the situation.
What about disgust?
According to your biological preferences, if someone, let's say, hasn't taken a shower for 3 weeks and they smell really bad, that is going to be pain in the moment, and it could be so painful that it's disgusting, right? That's what disgust really means on the painful level.
There's some belief then that means.
No.
Look at someone's behavior and you find it disgusting?
Not really, because you could smell a smell of a dead animal, and it's disgusting on a physical smell sense.
No, but I'm talking about behavior.
So you can find behavior.
I'm just going to tell it because otherwise it's hypothetical. So, and please don't judge me.
I already know what you're going to say.
Sometimes at work when I see people lying and covering up and lying about what they do and pretending that they know everything and they're just lying to your face, I find that disgusting. The lack of integrity. And I'm sorry, it's a small example, and then I feel that disgust. And then I tell myself they're not the doer, they're just acting that way because that's their conditioning. But it still hurts, and I don't know why.
So once again, when we go into these, it's a very fine line, and so we'll carry on the intellectual explanation that is being given, the intellectual understanding, and as that becomes clearer and clearer, and we investigate it for ourselves, we are able to start pulling apart the difference between the biological pain and the psychological suffering. So when we get angry, blame will arise simultaneous to that anger. And if something like you just described is there, that's painful, but because it's a certain type of pain, the likelihood is that it's going to also include blame with it. And when the blame falls away, both in anger and in disgust, the pain will still be seen, so it doesn't make their behavior nice.
Yeah.
But maybe the load of blame won't be there, and then it feels different. So just once again, if there's a dead animal and it smells really bad, that is physical pain, right? And the same with a human being that hasn't had a shower for a long time could smell really bad. To the extent that a judgment starts happening along with that pain, then that's the suffering. And that doesn't mean that we can't have a thought that assesses the physical pain and discerns it. So you can have a thought that says, this person hasn't had a shower for 3 weeks, and relative to hygiene standards, that's inappropriate. As long as we're clear that we've set up a benchmark, so relative to hygiene standards, not relative to how the world should look, right? Because the moment is not created relative to hygiene standards. The moment is created relative to source, i.e. meaning as source creates it.
So the last one. All this stuff coming up as you're speaking. So to that, people keep saying the universe is a mirror, life is a mirror. So to that point, to the standards point, if I'm being triggered or find someone's behavior disgusting or inappropriate or whatever, does that mean that there's something darkness inside me that I don't look at, and so I'm projecting it on the other person and I need to look inside myself?
Well, there's lots of different ways to see things. I mean, to me, what you just described, life as a mirror, you can see that life will put in front of us situations that are going to create automatically a reaction will happen. And so we can say, okay, life is now showing me. So remember, mirror is a metaphor in a sense. It might not be the perfect metaphor. Life is showing me something that needs to be seen. I continually judge the other for their behavior. And so effectively life is putting a situation that shows me that judgment is happening, and then we can look at what the judgment is. Another form of seeing life as a mirror is if you find yourself judging someone for lying, right? In a school of thought, and this is not a blanket rule, but in some situations, people that hate themselves for being liars will hate the other for lying. And then if we see that this link does exist in life, or this dynamic does exist in life, if we find ourselves judging the other for something, we might say, oh, do I hate myself for being that?
Do I lie? Yeah. Okay.
It's
or how do I lie?
Yeah.
Or how am I lying to myself?
Yeah. Yeah, it might not be in the same form that they're taking, but yeah. Let's hear what Jay has to say.
I imagine someone or people who are lying or hurting themselves because if they're unable to accept the truth and they're making up something that's not true, then they're really not accepting reality, and that must be very hurtful. They may be harming others, but they're harming themselves as well.
I agree.
And if somebody isn't taking a shower, I would just say, let's take a shower. You want to go swimming?
Yes, there are good ways of dealing with these things.
Okay, so but back to John. The thing that happened last time, which I wanted to ask you, was for the first time, instead of getting angry, when he blamed me, I just literally fell to the ground weeping. And something felt like, okay, that's a progress, because that just happened a different way than something protecting me, coming out to protect something.
Mm-hmm.
But there's got to be more to life than this, just being hit all the time with these different. And I know what you're saying is it'll happen, and there's something that trust, and those aren't minimal. I'm not saying that's minimized by what I'm saying, but if there was anything, regarding having it switched to pain, I mean, I got definitely a different reaction from him.
Yeah, so this isn't a suggestion of how you should act. That would be falling into the trap of thinking that life should look a certain way. All of the discussions here are just describing different dynamics. And one of the dynamics that is being described is that these belief systems change once awareness starts landing on them. Awareness lands on dynamics that it previously hasn't landed on. And so to the extent that we find ourselves witnessing what is happening inside and what is happening when you fall to the floor and how you feel, and start, and then along the lines of the intellectual understanding that's in place, it says, oh wow, that's shame. And previously there was a defending of myself as being right by attacking the other's attack on me. And now that defending myself as being right by attacking back isn't happening. So to the extent that we just become aware and observe, and we have the tools that can identify what's going on, that's the change happening. So I think it's important not to hear these talks and think, okay, I have to go and behave a certain way. So even the description that blame is a form of suffering can easily be interpreted as I shouldn't blame. And if we take on the idea I shouldn't blame, then it is not necessarily what's being suggested here. I shouldn't blame means I have to be a certain way, and the concept is that you'll only be the way you are in a particular moment, the way life has designed you to be. So surrender any shoulds or shouldn'ts, especially about guilt and blame, and if it arises, understand it's arising in the present moment based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and we're forced to react that way. No option. And the other is forced to react the way they do.
Okay. And I think I always have the tendency, like even as a small child, to try to guess what's going to happen in the chapter down the road instead of stay on the page I'm at. So
Yeah.
I'll just watch that too.
Yeah, the book's already written, so we don't need to worry about what is written, because the worry doesn't help. And trying to guess what is written is trying to imagine what a box of matches that are thrown on the floor is going to look like. We're not going to get it right. Along these lines, Stephen Hawking's, the physicist, Stephen Hawking, one of his essays that Ramesh used to refer to is titled, "Is Everything Predetermined?" And that's the title of the essay. And then the first line is, "Yes, everything is predetermined. Full stop." And then, yet, knowing that everything is predetermined doesn't allow us to know what is predetermined. So the physicist and the mystic can come to see that life is going to unfold one way. We know that from our own experience. How many ways has life unfolded in any particular moment? And if we look at the timeline of life, how many timelines are there? One. The mystics and the physicists know life only unfolds one way. That's the destined way it will unfold. Knowing that doesn't allow us to know how it's going to unfold, which is great. We wouldn't want to. That's the mystery.
So the final thing for me is my mind, because of the trauma that I went through young, always felt it needed to survive. So the mind is always telling me, you need me to survive. And this is saying that the mind, I understand working mind, but this is a psychological mind, is saying you need to strategize, you need to survive, you know. And this is saying trust the moment. Well, when something comes, whatever needs to happen is going to come with what you need to do in each moment. Mm-hmm. So it really slows everything down.
Yeah. We need to see that the psychological mind that says strategize doesn't deliver what we might expect it delivers. We can put a lot of effort into strategizing, and then the outcome is out of our control, sometimes radically different to what our strategy would expect. Having said that, there's a difference between psychological strategizing and biological strategizing. So to biologically strategize means, I have this feeling, this urge, this need, whatever, to get to this place in a week's time. And so it makes sense at some point, and I would wait for that point to happen, where we say, okay, now it's time for me to do some research to find out the best ways to get from here to where I need to go, and to put a plan in place. So that strategy is part of the unfolding of life. It's biological, it's intelligent, it's the way that life unfolds, it's the way that we do get from one place to another. At some point we have to put a plan in place. Understanding, the wisdom is to understand that my plan that I put in place may not eventuate, because it's only a concept I have of how life should look, that in a week's time I'll be there. Sometimes, often, life turns out more or less like we would like it to look, but we have to realize it turns out like we'd like it to look, not because we're in control, but because that's what's destined. And so putting in place a plan is fine. I like to say I write my plans in 4H pencil. That's a very light pencil that you can rub out easily. To the extent that you put your plans in big black marker means your attachment to that outcome. So biological planning, you might find yourself in a job that requires you to follow certain tasks. And so this understanding doesn't say we just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, well, what will be, will be. If we do throw our hands up in the air, what will be, will be. With it, you might get the feeling it's a sort of irresponsible attitude of what will be, will be. If that happens, it's also part of the story of life. We're forced to do that based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. That up-to-date conditioning could be listening to a teaching that says everything's predetermined, and we find that we interpret it in a way that says, oh, well, if that's the case, I'm just going to, who cares? It'll be what it'll be. And if that's the case, we might find that life starts delivering certain outcomes that may become part of our new conditioning, that says, oh, maybe I need to put a bit more thought into what I do in each moment. And then we come to see, the middle ground, the right attitude is doing your best in any moment, whatever that best happens to be, which means understanding if you have certain capacities, certain skills, that understanding everything is predetermined doesn't mean you don't apply your skills fully. So do your best, but understand the outcome ultimately is not in your control. So this is where the trust in God, but tether your camel, tie up your camel. So it doesn't mean it's the paradox of life. So for a long time I used to drive a scooter, a motorbike, and I didn't like wearing a helmet. It's a hot climate, put the helmet on, it gets very hot. And so I used to drive with my helmet on the handlebars sort of thing. And my attitude at that time was, what's destined to happen will happen. If I'm going to have an accident, I'm going to have an accident. And at some point, it started, I had these thoughts about accidents. I was starting to have these thoughts. And this was after suffering had sort of come to an end. So I'm just describing how life brings about change. And I started having these thoughts. And at some point I thought, this is silly driving without a helmet on. Because, yes, what will happen, but I'd much rather that what happens with me having a helmet on. And so I found myself putting my helmet on, going, oh, this is what's happening now. I'm putting on my helmet. And it was like a message from God saying, hey, you have to be a little bit more responsible. Don't claim ownership over the outcome, but don't be flippant. And then when we look at it, this responsibility, me being more responsible, is simply a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment, based on these thoughts, which were not my doing, they were arising. Those thoughts about having an accident and hitting my head on the ground and starting to realize how fragile the human skull and the human makeup can be on some levels. And, if the brain stops working, a lot of life changes. And so even that responsibleness responsibleness, is that right? Responsibility, is not my doing. It was a happening. And so when I look at it, not wearing a helmet wasn't any more right than wearing a helmet relative to how life was unfolding. It was always unfolding exactly as it was destined. But relative to safety standards or to intelligence, I now find that the fact that I put a helmet on when I ride my bike, I say, oh, that's more intelligent relative to safety standards. And what unfolds in life does follow a correlation, because this is a story of cause and effect. And so if we find ourselves functioning a certain way, it makes sense that certain outcomes that correlate with the way we function also happen. Not because we're in control, but because life is designed on some levels to be very, to correlate very closely with certain physics laws. You know, if you drop a glass on the floor 10 times, it's likely to break 9.5 times out of 10. You figure that, half times out of 10. You know what I mean?
I just had a question about when you were talking about the load of like negative feeling, tightness. Like when I sit with it and try not to judge it or try to identify, is this a sadness, is this anger, you know, what is this? I feel that it's kind of the same, it feels the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to like maybe use the story to bring it up and bring it up so that it can be released.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's, for me, it's important to drop the story and just be with the feeling.
Maybe in witnessing, in a way, witnessing is more about that. So to just be with it usually refers to just allowing it to be there without sort of diving into it. Mm-hmm. So to see that there is these different methodologies that are appropriate at different times. So to drop the story about the feeling actually tends to dissolve the feeling more so. Like it'll be there, and and then it dissolves. And that's not very helpful when we're trying to find out what is at the root of it. It's super helpful when we're seeing that suffering is actually not as real as we think. So to witness something and to see it dissolve is a insight, or leads us to an insight. Oh, that's not that real. It's not, you know, to the extent that we hold on to the story, it stays real. To the extent that we drop back into our being, the suffering dissolves. So these different methodologies are there to perform different functions. To the extent that we just allow ourselves to drop into being and it dissolves, and then start to believe that that's the solution, that's how suffering is going to one day end, might be, we have to investigate this, it might be a problem, because we might find ourselves habitually dropping into being and witnessing the feeling, thinking that that's going to solve it. But we might find that how many years do I have to keep doing this, because I keep getting triggered by life, and so the suffering keeps coming up, which then means I have to go back into witnessing and let it dissolve. And it's like, when is it going to stop? And so what's being suggested here is that one of the ways that it finally stops is a combination of the understanding that it's not as real as we had taken it to be, which we get from that other standpoint that you're talking about, plus the diving into the story and really feeling the story in its fullness, not just allowing it to be, but feeling it fully, and seeing the story of doership at the bottom of it. And so what you started off with, which allows me to elaborate on something I wanted to get to anyway, is that at first it feels all the same. And I think why you say that is because really all different forms of suffering, guilt, blame, expectation, are an uncomfortableness with oneself. And so when we feel it on the outer level, what we feel is this dull uncomfortableness without much definition. It doesn't have much story in it. It's just an uncomfortableness. And our job, in a sense, if we're following this methodology that I was talking about earlier of really feeling it, is to get it to have more definition, for it to change from a dull uncomfortableness to a sharp, a much more defined feeling of, let's say, resentment or hatred or grief and shame. And one of the ways that we can do that is to start putting words onto the feeling, because we don't know what it is exactly. And if we have an idea that it's either going to be guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, and in blame, for example, hatred and anger are the key, their resentment, jealousy, we might get a feeling that, okay, this isn't about me, this is about the other. So if we can feel in the feeling a broad category that it is, then we wipe out some of the others and we start focusing on the category that, let's say, blame. And if we don't get a feeling, then we can use the same method I'm going to suggest that works as we go deeper and deeper, and that's to put some words onto it. So we have this general feeling, and we don't know if it's guilt or blame or expectation. And so just put the feeling on it, go, this is guilt. And it just doesn't fit. So you go, this is blame. And you go, no, yeah, maybe. So then if it's maybe, then you think about the different types of blame. And you go, it's resentment. No, not resentment. It's hatred. And then suddenly when you put the right word on it, it's like color matching a wall with a lot of different swabs of color. And when you get the right one, you know this is it. So to the extent that you put the word on it in the broad category, and you get it, then you can start to refine down what it is. So you might say, okay, this is hatred, but what's it about? And then you might find it's about physical pain or about abandonment. And once you put the words on it, and you have to, flick through a whole series of abandonment, aloneness, separation. Once you get the right word on it, then it explodes into another layer of feeling. And very quickly the feeling might change from a broad uncomfortableness to a very specific feeling of abandonment, let's say. Abandonment actually fits under the guilt category, or both. It could be, you can feel hatred for being abandoned, and then we might find that at the bottom of the abandonment there is shame. Like, I feel like I was abandoned because I'm not good enough. And so that technique of putting words onto it is very good for refining the feeling.
Practice that. Thank you.
So when you get down to the level of, like, saying you feel abandonment, and then you realize that that's to do with shame, then you're feeling that.
Mm-hmm.
It flowers. And at some point you realize that when that happened, you were not with this teaching, and you did not realize that there's no doer. And so then sometimes it'll go, even though there is no life or God to blame, it will go out and, okay, if they aren't the doer, then why'd God let this happen, or whatever. And then you're just back in the same cycle.
Yeah, so to the extent that we put these words on and it flowers, then we're really now feeling the feeling. So the feeling can take over. The feeling can be expressed. So we put words onto what we're feeling. I hate you for what you did. I hate you for abandoning me, and whatever. You don't have to think about it. You just let the feeling express. And to the extent that you can even imagine if you're recording this, right, such that afterwards you play back the recording and you listen to what you're saying, and go, wow, and you can see the story of hatred and blame and shame in listening to the words. Now, you don't need to record it. You can. That might be useful. But to the extent that there's an awareness of what you're saying, it's almost like you're listening to someone else saying it. And then you can see the same theme in it. And to the extent that your intellectual understanding is different now about life, still allow all of that misunderstanding to express itself. And without even saying anything, you're just witnessing it, seeing it as this error that was put in place a long time ago. And to the extent that in your conscious mind you then say, yes, actually I don't blame the other or myself, but I blame God, then that's suffering being locked away in the present moment. You're transmuting the blame towards the other, and then new suffering is being formed in the present moment based on a current misunderstanding. Right? And at some point, you ask a question about blaming God, and the answer is that we will blame God, we're forced to blame God if we have a concept of God that allows blame for God to arise, meaning a belief of God. So let me be clear, concept doesn't mean belief, but usually if we have a concept that allows suffering to arise, it's a concept that's been turned into a belief. So if we can blame God, it means we have a belief of a God that is out there inflicting pain on us as humans. Like this is all a creation of Source, and Source is making me go through this. And so if that's our idea of God, we have to blame God. It will be part of destiny for us to have that belief of God and for that blame to happen. How it can be undone maybe is with this suggestion that God is not what we imagine in that context. There's something out there that has created this and putting us through it, but rather God as infinite creative potentiality has turned into the whole manifestation. So God has become the universe, the world, and all of the people in it. God has become the victim and the perpetrator. God has become you. So there isn't a God out there that is inflicting pain on you. There is a God that has become the pain and the experiencer of the pain. To the extent that we start to see God that way, not just intellectually, but as we start to see God and life that way, we might start to see life much more as a oneness experience happening right now. This experience is God in motion. To the extent we start to see life as a happening that is God, not that there is a God out there, but this is God in totality, God meaning consciousness or energy, not the God that we traditionally have an idea of, then we can't, the more we see life like this in the present moment, the less the idea of a God out there can survive. And so at some point we find, I understand logically, if I don't blame the other or I don't blame myself, it makes sense I have to blame God, but I find there's no blaming of God. And so then the conclusion is, I don't blame God because the belief of a God to blame doesn't exist. And why doesn't it exist? Because the experience of life has unfolded in such a way that the makeup in this moment doesn't include that idea of God.
I think God isn't in control. It's out of control.
God's out of control. In this concept, God doesn't even cognize what is going to be created. That tends to be a human idea of God as a cognizer. The definition that's put forward here is that Source is in its nature infinite creative potentiality, which means because it is creative potentiality, it has to manifest at some point. That's why if it's potential, at some point it has to manifest. That is the actualization of the potentiality. Otherwise, if it never manifested, we would call it dead. So infinite creative potentiality, and the infinite creative part means that whatever it manifests into, without it needing to have a cognition aspect to it, whatever it turns into is going to be infinitely creative. And when we look at this manifestation, just even through the limited capacity that the relative instruments in life have to see this manifestation, the intricacy of a plant leaf and nature and how it all harmonizes and balances, and especially if we bring in the concept of the universe as being a very large, infinitely large place, all in complete balance. And remember, so when I mentioned the universe as an infinitely large place, compared to this morning's meditation where we actually say the universe is this big, spontaneous in this moment, just what's here, this is the universe. But we're not going to hold that absolutely. If we find ourselves looking through a telescope, it creates the impression of a massive, no, massive is not the right word, universe. So it's both. And if we start looking at the complexity and the creativity of this story of life, a story of life that we can say is a story of evolution. When we look at from the Big Bang onwards, all of this movement has happened, and at some point the dinosaurs were the most complex form of life in this story of life, and God was seeing the universe through the vehicle of the dinosaurs. The consciousness that's currently functioning through humans, the one consciousness of Source, at some point was functioning through the far less complex instrument of a dinosaur. And life was an evolution. The story of life is an evolution where there is an evolution of nature, an evolution of not consciousness, but an evolution of nature, an evolution of industry and technology, an evolution of spirituality, which really is an evolution of intellect that at some point has got wrong ideas and then evolves so that the intellectual ideas become more aligned with what is, which means the veil that gets in the way of the self-realization gets thinner. And maybe at some point in the future, the evolution is an evolution where there will be a much larger realization on a larger scale, or the evolution is where humans bring about an end to human life, and on the story will go. Or maybe that's the final chapter. Maybe I didn't answer the question, I forgot what it was.
So this, like this energy that we all have, the load of negative energy, is there a limit to that and it just gets triggered? So is it within each person?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
each person has a limited amount, and that it's not infinite, right? I mean, at some point, if you work on it, it will go away.
I would say, yeah, I'd say in according the concept that is put forward that makes sense in this way of seeing life is it's definitely limited. Whether it's going to get exhausted is not in your control. It requires life to bring about whatever is required to exhaust the limited amount of energy that's there. And at some point it becomes apparent that what happens in exhausting it is not each bit of the load being experienced, but rather an underlying recognition of a principle gets seen. So a principle that doership, let's say, makes no sense when life is seen from a different perspective, and attachment to outcome makes no sense. Or on an even deeper level, we could see the recognition that all beliefs are a mistake, that a belief is a relative concept that has been treated as truth. So a relative concept is, all concepts are relative. That table is beautiful, that table is made of wood, that table is what I eat on. Right? They could be accurate, but they're relative concepts. And we as humans, because we see ourselves on this physical level, see that to be truth, because we don't recognize the essence of which we are, which is truth. And so we think this I am is a result of the biological. And now the fact that the I am is much more true than the biological. When we don't recognize the I am, it's still there, and we think it belongs to the biological. So we say, oh, the biological is truth, which means we stop seeing the physical realm as relative. We start relating to it as truth. So then we look at the table and we say, yeah, well, that's wood. So that's truth. The concept that the table is made of wood, we treat it as a truth. And beliefs are always something that's an error. We can never have a belief that is true. A belief is always a concept that is related to as though it's truth, and no concepts are truth. So if we start to see that my beliefs are all errors, so if we see on a fundamental level, on a level of principle, that belief makes no sense. So once we start seeing one belief, two beliefs, three beliefs, say they make sense, don't make sense. Then we can see, oh wow, I have all these beliefs. And none of them, in principle, would make sense. So we don't have to go and undo each belief.
Is there a difference between belief and a knowing? Because like I know that I exist, that's a knowing.
That, if in this set of concepts, the only truth in the manifestation, and the wording in the manifestation is important. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am, that I exist. That's undeniable. Everything else is relative.
So you're saying if once you come to that deep realization that you're not the doer, then you can bypass whatever. Is it like, and where does karma come in? Is there such a thing as karma? You know, like we're destined to suffer. You know.
There is. Okay, let's not jump onto karma. That's another satsang. But yeah, so this is what I'm talking about here, about how once we see an underlying principle as false, everything that stands on it, once the principle is dissolved, everything that stands on it can collapse. And so we don't need to go and uproot each individual belief. We just need to see that belief in itself is an error. To believe anything is an error. So it's nice to say, I don't know. At some point we stop saying I don't know, because we realize, oh, relatively speaking, I know plenty of things. I know how to boil an egg, I know how to drive a car. If someone asks me where the shops are, if I hold on to this I don't know too strongly, which is really pointing to I don't know anything absolutely, then my answer would have to be to someone when they ask me where's the shop, say, oh, I don't know. Yeah. Which is not how we live life. It's not how we live life even when we realize I don't know. So to know what I don't know means I don't know anything absolutely.
Yeah.
When I find myself thinking in a way where the thought is saying this is absolute, then I don't know can come up. But when someone asks me where the shops are, I say, oh, you go down the road, turn left, and it's on your right. Anyway, going back, we see the principle of something is wrong. We might need to uproot a handful of beliefs by looking at them and seeing that they're wrong. And in seeing an individual belief as wrong can show us the principle at the bottom of it. Then we see another belief which is different to the first belief, but we see the principle is the same. And so we might need to uproot 5 or 6 or 7. And then we start to see, oh, the principle of them is all the same. And that's what is the undoing of the ground on which all beliefs, and they all will collapse very quickly. And that's what is referred to as cutting the Goydian knot, where you cut that and the whole thing falls apart.
So until that happens, would you say it's a blessing to be triggered? Because even if you release little by little, it's...
Yeah, in releasing little by little, you're able to start seeing the principle below what is being released. So those releases are the handful of things that need to be uprooted one by one, not just to uproot them, but also to see the principle behind what is there.
The principle, the theme?
The theme, so in this case, a lot of the suffering, all of the suffering that comes up is going to include guilt, blame, pride, expectation, all based on doership, seeing the other as the doer, seeing events in the past, which in practice are just pleasure or pain in the moment, you know. But then we realize, my attitude at that time put in place a load of resistance to the flow of life on much more than a biological level, put in place a resistance on a psychological level. And that's the load of guilt and blame that we're carrying around. And at some point, the load of guilt and blame will just, the whole lot of it will collapse. Once the principle of doership and attachment to outcome is seen as false, that's the cutting of the straps of this backpack that we're carrying.
So if you're saying that the only thing that we can know for certain is the sense of I am, and that everything else could be considered a belief,
Or is relative.
is relative. So,
And if we treat it as absolute, it would become a belief.
okay, so because even to see something as a belief would mean that we have already questioned the absolute reality of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I wouldn't think, I kind of missed what you were saying earlier, but I wouldn't think to question that the table is made of wood is a belief necessarily. So to even question that,
Or I am male. Or you are female.
yeah. Like I guess without being able to distinguish the principal belief from the multitude of beliefs that spring from that, it would seem like I would need to question everything first. Or I guess your suggestion is that you're basically giving us the principal belief that it is the doership, and that by questioning that you can uproot everything else.
Yes, that's an important one that's being presented. So that sort of narrows down the beliefs that are worthwhile looking at. But actually, no, in when we start talking about beliefs and concepts, it's all beliefs. If you hold on to, let go of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, but still hold a whole lot of other beliefs, we'll find that the identity is contained in any belief. Because part of the root of the identity is a misidentification of who we are, whereby what we really are, which is absolute, is not recognized, and what we are on a much more relative level is identified as real. And that's one of the core errors in the identity. The I am not the doer and I need pleasure in order to be complete is sort of a level above that. Our knowing ourselves is a landing of awareness on an aspect of the manifestation that has been ignored. An absolute aspect of the manifestation that's been ignored. And so what that really means is that we need to start to see the manifestation as relative. That's the neti process, is not this, not that. I'm not this. Anything that can be observed is not what I am. So to the extent that we realize, a table is is there because of my perception of it. My perception of it is relative. My eyes are relative. 1 minute I might have what we call 20/20 vision, and the next minute I might have fuzzy vision and need glasses. Might also come to realize that what we call 20/20 vision is very relative, and if our eyes were much more complex instruments, or if we put additional instruments on top of the lens of the eyes, we can have much more than 20/20 vision, maybe even X-ray vision or night vision. And so if we start to see, the senses are relative. The body, the brain in particular, is a relative instrument, working off very relative information. All relative because the information that my brain receives is information from my senses, which are relative. So then we say, how can I ever relate to a table as absolute, when a table is just an impression of perception, which is relative, and that my idea of it as a table is a thought, a product of the brain, which is relative, which doesn't mean that that there isn't a place for relative perception and intellect, which is relative, but we mustn't make the mistake of relating to it as absolute. And we have.
Well, so I can see how using the intellect, we can question the beliefs that we have held to be true, and that by doing so, they become less, become more fuzzy. But I guess my confusion is that, for example, I can question, okay, is it true I am a woman? And through inquiry, I can say that, okay, I cannot know with absolute certainty that I'm a woman, but without the experience of what I am, I feel like just to say, okay, then I am not a woman is another concept.
Yes, I wouldn't suggest that you go to the opposite extreme and believe that you're not a woman. It's about...
Well, so then you arrive at this place of I don't know.
Yes, which then means that you start holding concepts as... So if someone says, so which concept are you going to run with in life? That you are a woman or that you're not a woman? Or that you're a woman or that you're a man? So I would run with the concept on that level, I'm a man. But I won't hold it as absolute, because in meditation, when I'm present with my experience in meditation, I am there, but my maleness is less obvious. Maybe even unavailable in meditation, which doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know, maybe the maleness is still there. That would be the logical assumption. What do you mean your maleness is not there? You're sitting in meditation. The male is sitting in meditation. But to the extent I become present with the meditation, which means the sense objects fall away in a deep meditation, thought falls away. My experience is there is two things, not really two, not really one, that remain present, and that is the sense of existence and the functioning of awareness. And what they are aware of is, in the most basic meditation, the absence of a body, the absence of a world, and yet I am. So we can say, I have never known the manifestation in the absence of I am. So that is the only truth in the manifestation, that which is undeniable in all of my experience in the manifestation. So when it comes to spiritual seeking, there is a definition of truth that is very useful, that on a practical daily living people will say, how is that your definition of truth? And it may not be relevant on a practical daily living approach. But when we're doing a deep exploration of who am I, or knowing truth, because that's what we yearn for at some point, I want to know the truth. The definition that struck me at some point and became an amazing addition in this exploration is the definition that says that which is true is ever present and unchanging. That which changes is unreal. And real and true, the word real and the word true are sort of interchangeable. So that which is real is ever present and unchanging. That which is true is ever present and unchanging. That which changes, that which comes and goes, is unreal or untrue. But remember, this is the investigation on that deep level of knowing oneself. So to that extent, we can start looking at the world as it presents and see, it's always changing. Everything is always changing. And therefore, the world is not truth. The world, in some teachings, we will say the world is unreal. So
I guess I'm trying to reconcile, like, this morning's meditation I felt was so deep. I just felt so I don't know, it was so nice. and it was, without the need for use of investigation in a way, all this conceptual exercise. And so coming from that, and then, this afternoon now, where it seems like we're approaching it from the other end, where using concepts to deconstruct concepts to arrive at that sense of being, or whatever it was from this morning. And that approach seems more I don't know, more difficult.
It in my experience, it's a combination of the two working together that is so valuable, where we can be guided into this place of being that demonstrates so much that is not normally recognizable. And then hopefully the concepts can use that has been revealed in the meditation as a frame of reference, let's say, to allow us to put ticks next to the concepts more so than when we're not dropping into that being. And so someone might say, well, why do I need to put ticks next to it? Why don't I just drop into being all the time? The thing is that if we drop into being, it's all very nice and well there and then. There's no doubt that that's connection to self, presence, and peace. But what happens is when we leave satsang, go outside, life triggers us, and we might think that, I have to drop into being more and more. But funnily enough, and that's meditation, that's the path of meditation. Path of meditation is known, which could be a little sad for some people to hear this, but it's known as the ant path. The path of jnana yoga is known as the bird path, because the ant path is much, much slower. And in a meditation path, purely meditation path, usually the practice is to sit for years and years sometimes without much instruction from the master. The master might give you an instruction once every 8 months. And the rest of the time you just sit, waiting for, not really waiting, but over time things become revealed as you sit in meditation. So, I might go off topic, but anyway, Ramesh's teacher was Nisargadatta. Nisargadatta's teacher was Siddharameshwar Maharaj. And his teacher was in the path of meditation, from what I understand. And there was a deviation from the path of meditation, what's known as the ant path. And Siddharameshwar had jnana yoga come into his path. And it's a much quicker path if that happens to be our destiny, because so much of what is seen in meditation over time is pointed at through the path of jnana. And so if you can take the pointers and then take that information, the conceptual pointers, and start to observe it in the meditation, it basically means someone has handed you their insights that they maybe have, in the ant path, have taken them years and years and years to see each insight. And they say, hey, look for this. A bit like someone who's been bird watching, and they finally, after years, figure out how this bird flies into its nest or whatever. And it's taken them 20 years to figure it out, of watching. You know, this bird comes back once every 3 months, and you don't know when it's going to come back. And they get it, and then they educate someone else through concept. And this person can sit there for, 3 weeks and see the bird come in, because they know where they're looking, and etc., etc. So even though the concept side of things might seem a little dry to start with, when we start seeing how powerful it is because of what it's pointing at, then the use of the concepts and dropping into being and meditation together is great.
So just to conclude, I guess I hadn't thought of it quite as concept versus meditation, so that's helpful. I think what I was thinking of it more in terms of conceptual and experiential, but I somehow feel that the conceptual is meant to point at the experiential, and that we verify the concepts through experiential. Like the investigation is meant to be experiential.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so they're not mutually exclusive, but they...
No, this is like, if we listen to the recording at the very beginning of the thing, it's saying, the whole point of the conceptual framework is for you to understand it intellectually and then see for yourself in daily living what the concepts are pointing at. So that as we see for ourselves what the concept is pointing at, which means we have to look at the apple on the table, not just listen to the concept that there is an apple on the table. And once we actually look where the concepts are pointing, then what we see, especially if we start seeing it not through the brain so much, but more witnessing, then the concepts turn into experiential seeing of life, and eventually the whole conceptual framework can be thrown away, unless you happen to need it to teach someone, then it happens to stay. But otherwise, it automatically at some point dissolves. And the idea that everything's predetermined, you go, well, maybe, who cares? I just find myself living life in such a way that suffering doesn't arise, because the concepts and the observation and the insights have done what they need to do. And then we're no longer looking at life conceptually. So in my experience, what happened was I came across books. I didn't have a teacher until I met Ramesh, and that was 5 years into the process, where I'd say 80% of what needed to fall away had fallen away already before meeting a teacher, because the books that I was reading were, in my case, treated as pointers. I didn't know this was happening, I only see it in hindsight, that whenever I read a book, it triggered a contemplation about what was read. The contemplation automatically started looking around in life for confirmation of what the concept was saying. And as the dynamics were seen, the dynamics that were being pointed at by the concept, then the concept flowered into insight. It's like, I see it. I see what the concept is saying. And there's this amazing difference. I'm sure you've had the experience where at some point you just get it. You see what previously we only understood at some level. And the seeing clicks the concept into a different level. It sort of locks it in place where it's no longer a concept, it just becomes part of the being. And maybe the concept isn't even there, it's dissolved whatever was in the way of seeing things as they are.
So going back to initially when you were talking about questioning our beliefs, even the questioning of beliefs is an experience, like it needs to go beyond basically the conceptual questioning to a seeing that the belief is not true.
Yeah, and in practical terms, it can be just seeing the story that stems out of a belief that I am the body, for example. And we can see that when life turns out a certain way, there is a resistance on a psychological level. The biological resistance makes sense, right? If something's coming at us and squashing us, we're going to push it back. Biological resistance. To the extent that there is psychological suffering, and awareness becomes aware of the psychological suffering, we might realize that, this is the result of the belief that I am the body. The belief I am the body and I need this and this and this to be complete. And to the extent that we see that this suffering can instantaneously stop if something happens that says, like, I don't know. The I don't know in itself is grace when it hits in a way where it really cuts off the story. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I'm the body. I don't know that I need life to be a certain way. And then the suffering falls away. And for a moment, we'll see actually the belief is just a belief. 1 minute it's there, like it's truth. Then I don't know comes up and cuts it off. And it's not there anymore. So we start seeing, for the first time maybe, that there's these beliefs that don't feel like beliefs. We might never have heard about the notion of the difference between concepts and beliefs. And like you said, I wouldn't question the idea that I am male, or in your case that you're female. That's a given, isn't it? That's true. Maybe it's not as true as we, especially relative to the use of the word truth as it needs to be used relative to this seeking process.
Thank you.
I guess I have to reformulate here. So this might, in some cases, not even be a process per se. It you could be looking at this for a while, and all of a sudden, oh wow, all this stuff I thought was true was just an idea, just something temporary. And what's not temporary is what's showing up.
Mm-hmm. What in particular, when you say what's showing up?
What's showing up in my mind, all that, what's showing up energetically, let's say, not even a thought, is not temporary.
Mm-hmm. So everything
the sense of being is the piece of it that's not temporary.
Mm-hmm.
So, while this body exists, yeah, I'm a guy. But as soon as it doesn't, well, there's awareness, but the guy thing is gone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the temporary piece.
Mm-hmm.
There was something else, but I can't think of it right now. So I guess it isn't important.
Yeah, that's the sentiment. Yeah, and so even the idea that on the one hand that this that the process is a process and it takes time. You know, we hear teachings that say there is no process, there is no time. It can happen right now. I agree. And at the same time, there's a process and it takes time. And that's very clear that, you know, you start reading spiritual books in 1999, and then in 2001 something happens, 2000, and it's true that the awakening is spontaneous. If we don't realize that that spontaneous cut or drop, let's say, that happens in this moment, that doesn't take time, if we don't realize that that on one level is quite clearly a result of everything that came before, then we might say, oh, there is no process, it's all spontaneous. But maybe that's a limited perspective of how that spontaneous moment...
That spontaneousness took some time to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so why there's a teaching that says it doesn't take any time and it's available right now, very powerful. Yeah, I think it's so important for us to understand teachings as teachings, not as truth. The teaching is trying to undo an error. And one of the biggest errors that we have is that we're looking for things in the future. We feel that we're not complete now. We feel we're the doer and we have to make things happen. That's putting it in the terms of this teaching. And another teaching says, let me not introduce all of these concepts about doer and thing. Let me just say, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, and you're complete now, which they don't even say you're complete now. It's available right now.
And both can be true.
Yes.
Oh.
Because it's a teaching. It's a concept. Every concept has its opposite concept. So to the extent that we then hold on to that concept and say, there is no process, at some point we'll realize, oh, I'm being a bit deluded here. I'm ignoring the fact that, yes, there was a spontaneous happening, let's say, where anything that I believed I needed to know, I needed to gain knowledge, all of that was false in that spontaneous moment. It wasn't about gaining anything. And I realized that what was realized in this moment was always here. So from that point of view, we can put ticks next to the there's nowhere to go, it's available right now. And that's essentially what a meditation is doing. It brings you into the now. It says don't think about anything. Just be, stop, relax.
So in a way you could say, yeah, it's already here, but it might take some time to see that.
Yeah. And when we see it, it's right now.
Yeah.
So then we can have hold the paradox.
Thanks.
Mm.